All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 7, Section 3, Debating Democracy. So, following the American Revolution, you had 13 new states and one new nation, being the United States of America. And those 13 states and the national government, and the nation, need a government. And so we're going to look at some of the ways that the various states sought to set up their own constitutions, and then how did that have an influence on what eventually became the national constitution. So we're not going to talk about all of them, but I do want to focus on a few, beginning first with John Adams and his work, Thoughts on Government. He was, of course, instrumental in creating the government in Massachusetts. And even though these state governments do vary a little bit, they do share a lot of common forms. And one of them, of course, is this idea of separation of powers. The title is pretty explanatory there. It just means that in setting up a government, you don't allocate all the power into one area or one chamber. So, for example, when you have something like a monarchy and you have a king, well, that absolute ruler has all the power. Instead, maybe you set up something like the king and the parliament, and this was the case in England, and then you could separate out the powers so that neither one can become tyrannical, because that is, of course, one of the concerns of a lot of these founding father types. This idea about separation of powers, you had seen it historically in places like the Roman Republic. Montesquieu was the French Enlightenment. Thinker who really sort of promoted this idea. And of course, one of the biggest advocates for this was, or who used these ideas, was, of course, John Adams of Massachusetts, who for the most part really sought to create a balanced government. And that's kind of a good way of thinking about the government in Massachusetts. It ended up being pretty balanced. Now, again, just to kind of review a couple of terms that we talked about previously. Again, Republican means elected representatives. All the state constitutions had a Republican-style government. Elections would be held, and then these, whoever the representatives who were elected would then go ahead and pass the laws. This idea about checks and balances, which is related to the separation of power, promoting the idea of three branches of government. This was something that was used in Massachusetts, but the idea is that you would have three different branches, each of them having slightly different responsibilities. The executive, the legislative, which passes the laws, and the judicial, and that you create a system of checks and balances within the Constitution so that each of the branches can check one another. And this is really designed to make sure that no one branch becomes too powerful. And of course, if you look at the English model up here, you have a king and the parliament, and they could check, one another's power. But, if the king becomes too powerful, then parliament can check it. If parliament becomes too powerful, then perhaps the king can check it. But, the same idea was adopted to colonial governments. Here you have the executive branch, which in most cases would look like a governor. The legislative branch, which passes the laws, and the judicial branch, of course, would be to essentially interpret those laws. And so this idea about creating a separation of powers and checks and balances was used by a number of state governments, not all of them. But each of these governments had to, more or less, where they could agree upon ideas about representative electives and separating powers and checks and balances. Where they differed was to what extent should they have the process be democratic. So there was differences. Could there be too much democracy? Too few, right? And this is where some of the disagreements could come from. So, for example, in Pennsylvania created what we might call the most democratic, and at the time what we would call the most radical form of government. that was one that did not hold, and recall this from last section, did not hold any property requirements to vote, whereas in all states there was some sort of property requirement to vote, not in Pennsylvania. This was and as you can see, because more people were eligible to vote, it was a more democratic system. There was no executive branch. Pennsylvania really feared that a governor would essentially act like a king. And so the best way to avoid that type of power in one single person's hands was essentially not to have any executive branch at all. Pennsylvania also had a unicameral or single house representative government. That meant just one Congress. People would be elected to one body. There'd be one house there, right? So no check on that Congress, so to speak. And so all of this, of course, was, in the eyes of most other states, this was seen as too much democracy. And of course, the balancing act that many of these states are trying to do is, what is the balance between tyranny and anarchy, right? How do you find kind of a middle ground between those two? This right here is a picture of that Constitution in Pennsylvania. Other governments put a much stronger emphasis on wealth. So for example, in Maryland and South Carolina, in order to vote and hold office, you had to not just own property, but own a certain amount of property. And this ensured that those governments were dominated more so by an elite class. I mean, that was certainly true in pretty much all the other states, is that you had to, like we mentioned in the last section, you had to own property to be invested in the nation and therefore be allowed to participate in voting and holding office. In some of the southern colonies, that was more true, right? More true. Now, on the national level, you had the creation of the national government. So we'll write national government. In the form of the Articles of Confederation. This is also what we might call the first constitution to the United States. All right, first constitution to the United States. So if we go back up here, maybe we'll go ahead and use a different color just to mark it. 13 states led to 13 different state governments, right? And each government can do things kind of their own way. Massachusetts was generally balanced. Pennsylvania was the most democratic and radical. Maryland and South Carolina put a stronger emphasis on wealth. The national government was the Articles of Confederation, right? This is how do all 13 states interact with one another, right? How do all 13 states interact with one another? And in creating this national government, what the states mostly feared was a strong national government, right? There was fear, I'm gonna write down fear of a strong national government. Given everything that had happened with Great Britain, right? Recall that Great Britain, in the eyes of the colonists, was a government that was too strong, too tyrannical. And so the idea is, let's not create another strong national government, because that's going to create more problems than solutions. Instead, this Articles government is more like a league of friendship. It's more like a treaty between the states. But at the end of the day, it's the states that retain their sovereignty, and sovereignty essentially means independent. And kind of a good way of thinking about it in today's terms is, like, you can think of all 13 states as being like their own different countries, and then they just had sort of this agreement with one another that in certain circumstances they would get on the same page. And for that reason, because they feared a strong national government, they created the Articles of Confederation as a mostly weak and decentralized government, right? Weak and decentralized. So what was its organization? Well, it had a one-house legislature. If you're not familiar, legislature means to pass laws. This was more or less a continuation, and excuse my spelling, of the Continental Congress, which essentially was a meeting of the 13 states. The unicameral legislative branch, or just the Congress as it's called in the Articles period, was more or less the same thing, just a meeting of those 13 states. There was no president of the United States under the Articles period, so that's no executive branch. right? And no judicial branch. So if we draw our three powers, right, executive, legislative, and judicial, right, and we think about the system of checks and balances that John Adams and Montesquieu and all those guys had, at the national level, you don't have these parts, right? There's no executive branch, there's no judicial branch. All you have is this Congress, and they're meeting, the 13 states, right? In order to pass laws, right? So pass laws on a national level, you need 9 votes. That's 9 out of 13. And in order to amend, which means to change the articles, right? So you write the Articles of Confederation. Here it is, right? It sort of outlines all these things for what the government will be. In order to change that, you need 13 of 13, that all 100% of the states have to agree in order to amend the articles. This process of both making laws and amending the articles was made very difficult. And it was done that way on purpose in order to ensure that if something was going to apply to all 13 states, right? So if there was a law that was going to apply to all 13 states, at least 9 out of 13 had to agree on it. And if you're going to change the rule book, everyone had to agree upon it. And that was the idea. One of the key things that the Articles government lacked was the ability to tax. There was no authority to tax. And this becomes a major problem because following the American Revolution, the nation's financial health is very poor, right? Very poor. Think about the war debt, right? Even though the Americans won against the British, it was enormously costly. They have a lot of what we might call soldiers' salaries that haven't been paid. These are soldiers who fought for the American side who haven't been paid. And a lot of the trading got disrupted during the war years. So the financial health is very, very badly. Now, there are a group of nationalists, people like Alexander Hamilton, people like James Madison, who recognize essentially that, the Articles government cannot deal with the nation's financial health, right? So it's not going to solve the economic problems. And so they call for sort of various changes, laws, things that might help the economy of the United States, things like taxes, things like a national bank, paying off the salaries. The problem is none of those are able to get passed because the lawmaking process is very difficult. Not all the states are getting on board with the laws that would be required in order to solve this financial problem. So this issue of financial health is a major, major, major problem in this very early period. And in fact, as we'll learn in a little bit, is one of the catalysts for major, major change. Now, one of the things that the Articles government actually does do right, the economy is a mess, but what it does do right is the problem of Western land. And in order for this Western land or this Western land question to be resolved, one of the things states had to do was to give up various claims that they made to Western territory. So if we look at this map here, recall that, for example, before the American Revolution, and maybe I'll use color to make it more clear, the border of the 13 colonies was somewhere in here, and this had belonged previously to France, or it had belonged to France since the 7 Years' War, but this belonged to British territory, but it was made off limits to the colonists via the Proclamation Line of 1763. The British essentially held the colonists at bay. Now all this territory belongs to the United States. So the first issue was that once that territory had passed to the U.S., and all the states are essentially like their own independent countries, they each made claims on the land. So for example, this map is showing you that Connecticut claimed this territory as its own, and you had competing interests, competing states claiming this territory. In order to make this question of Western land work, each of these states had to forfeit their claims, which they did, right? Which they did. And then what the government did, the national government did, was that they sold the land. And this essentially solved two problems, right? On the one hand, it settled the land, which of course is what many of the colonists had wanted to do for quite a long time. Settling the land makes it productive. You can extract tax revenue, you raise crops on it, whatever you do. But you also, while you sold it, you also made money, and that money could then go off to paying the debts. And so this land ordinance, the idea of selling Western lands, was incredibly successful in this period. One of these ordinances in particular, the Northwest Ordinance, was crucial for two reasons. First of all, it set up the idea that there would be new states. That means in addition to the 13 plus how many ever that there would be, the Northwest Ordinance itself was actually this territory right here, right? So this was actually what it applied to. And it said that 3 to 5 new states would be created in this region, but it created essentially the blueprint, or even just the idea that there would be new states, because that was one of the things that was debated. Should there only be 13 states in the United States, or should we add more? And if we add more states, should they be equal or should they be lesser? Essentially, the Northwest Ordinance not only set up a way to add new states to the Union, but also said that they would be equal, right? Equal to the original 13. So, as we continue to study American history, we'll kind of talk about how some of these states fill in. And eventually it was based off of population. Once a territory reached a certain population, then it could apply for statehood. Another important thing the Northwest Ordinance did in particular was that it banned slavery, right? It banned slavery. And what you have here is, in some ways, some of the origins to the future conflict of the Civil War. We'll talk about that more a little bit at a later point. But this territory up here, because of the Northwest Ordinance, is essentially free soil, right? Free soil. And you can see how they were divided up. Actually, let me go ahead and scroll down a little bit. You can see how the land was divided up. It was divided up into tiny, neat little squares, and that was sold off for people to eventually settle on it. Now, it's clear that even though this is a success, the question about Western lands, there still are a lot of problems in the nation, and Shays Rebellion, more so than anything else, kind of reveal the issues with the Articles government. So much so that there's going to be a call to amend or change the government. Shays Rebellion is led by Daniel Shays. He was a veteran of the American Revolutionary War. This is a combination of farmers who are greatly in debt. These are veterans who still haven't been owed their money, right? They're holding IOUs because the national government hasn't paid them for this service. And you have rapid inflation that is making things even more difficult. So it's in part a financial problem. It takes place in Western Massachusetts, and what Daniel Shays does is that he leads farmers and veterans, breaking people out of jail who were put in jail for debts that they defaulted on. This was attempted to be put down by the Massachusetts militia, but there was not enough military strength there, and that revealed one of the problems with the Articles government, and that was the inability, or we'll just say cannot, draft a national military or a national army. Each state had their own militia, right? There was a militia in Massachusetts, Virginia, and you could have a national government or national army like the Continental Army, but you couldn't forcibly do it, right? You couldn't draft it. You could only call on other states to lend you their militias. Ultimately, the decision lied in that state. And so because Shays Rebellion went on for so long, especially people like George Washington, who was much more concerned with the military aspect of it, because George Washington looked at Shays Rebellion and said, look, if these farmers can cause such a big problem, what's going to happen to the nation's security when a foreign country like France or Great Britain attacks? The U.S. is going to be toast, essentially. And so this question about stability, right, whether or not this weak, decentralized government can do the duties that are required to save the country is, seriously in question.